The morning mist hung over the Norman countryside like a burial shroud, as Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson crouched behind his Sherman tank, watching German Panzer IV tanks retreat eastward through his binoculars. It was August 12th, 1944, and what began as Operation Cobra had evolved into something far more deadly, a potential encirclement that could crush the entire German 7th Army in a steel vise. Patterson lowered his field glasses and turned to his radio operator. "Tell General Bradley we have visual confirmation Jerry's pulling back fast toward Falaise. The pocket's forming just like planned." The young sergeant nodded and began transmitting the coded message that would seal the fate of thousands. 2 weeks earlier, the American breakout from Senla had shattered German defenses like a sledgehammer through glass. General Omar Bradley's First Army had punched through Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's weakened lines, creating the opportunity that Allied commanders had dreamed of since D-Day. Now, as General George Patton's Third Army raced eastward and British forces pushed south from Caen, the jaws of a massive trap were closing around Army Group B. Field Marshal von Kluge stood in his command bunker near Morton, studying maps covered in red arrows that seemed to point in every direction except the right one. His weathered face showed the strain of commanding a retreating army against overwhelming odds. "Mynheer," his chief of staff reported, "the Americans have taken Avranches. General Patton's tanks are already past Mayenne and heading for Le Mans." But von Kluge can see what the Führer in his distant bunker could not. Army Group B was walking into a death trap. The American breakout had been too swift, too powerful. Now, with Canadian forces pushing down from the north and Americans racing up from the south, his entire Army Group risked encirclement in what military historians would later call the Falaise Pocket, as referenced in Stephen Ambrose's Citizen Soldiers. The speed of the American advance caught German forces completely off guard, with many units still believing they were conducting an orderly withdrawal when the pocket began to form. Major Wilhelm Hoffman of the 21st Panzer Division watched American artillery shells burst among his retreating columns. His half-track jolted over shell holes as machine gun fire from P-51 Mustang fighters strafed the road ahead. "Faster," he shouted to his driver. "We must reach the Dives River before the Americans cut us off completely." The irony was bitter. These same roads had carried Wehrmacht forces in their lightning advance through France just 4 years earlier. Now they carried the remnants of Hitler's Atlantic Wall garrison in desperate flight toward the Seine. But this retreat was different with each passing hour. The escape routes grew narrower as Allied forces converged from 3 directions. General Bradley had recognized the opportunity immediately. If American and British forces could link up near Falaise and Argenton, they would trap the bulk of German forces west of the Seine. It would be the largest encirclement of German forces since Stalingrad, potentially ending the war in the West months ahead of schedule. The race was on. Could the Germans escape the tightening noose? Or would the Norman fields become the graveyard of Army Group B? As Patterson's Sherman tanks rolled eastward through the morning mist, the answer seemed to hang in the sulphurous air like smoke from 1,000 burning vehicles. Retake Avranches and split the American forces. Von Kluge closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It was August 7th, 1944, and Hitler's order would doom thousands of German soldiers to death or capture. The field marshal had seen the intelligence reports American forces were already streaming through the Avranches gap like water through a broken dam. A counterattack now would only drive his remaining reserves deeper into the forming pocket. "Jawohl, mein Führer," von Kluge replied, knowing that disobedience meant a firing squad. As the radio went silent, he turned to General Heinrich Eberbach, commander of Panzer Group West. "Prepare the attack on Morton. Use everything we have left." The German counteroffensive began before dawn on August 7th. SS Oberfuhrer Rudolf Lehmann's 2nd SS Panzer Division led the assault, their Tiger tanks rumbling through the morning darkness toward the American positions around Morton. But the Americans were ready. Major General Leland Hobbs of the 30th Infantry Division had positioned his forces on Hill 317, overlooking the main approach routes. As the German armor emerged from the mist, American anti-tank guns and bazookas opened fire. The narrow Norman roads became killing fields as Panzerfaust rockets met Sherman tanks. In deadly duels among the hedgerows. "They're coming right at us," shouted Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes as he adjusted his 57mm anti-tank gun. The first Tiger tank appeared like a steel monster emerging from hell, its 88mm gun swiveling toward his position. Hayes fired first, his armor-piercing round striking the Tiger's turret with a shower of sparks, but failing to penetrate. The return shot obliterated his gun position, but Hayes had already rolled into a ditch. miraculously surviving. The attack stalled within hours. American air power descended like avenging angels, with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs turning German columns into burning wreckage. Hitler's gamble had failed catastrophically, and now the precious armored reserves that might have covered a withdrawal were trapped in the growing pocket. Meanwhile, General Patton's Third Army continued its spectacular advance eastward. His 4th Armored Division reached Le Mans on August 8th, then swung north toward Olenkin. The southern jaw of the trap was forming exactly as planned. "We've got them in a hell of a fix," Patton told his staff officers. "Now we just have to slam the door shut." To the north, Canadian forces under General Guy Simons launched Operation Total Eyes, driving south from Caen toward Falaise. The plan was simple in concept, but devastating in execution. American forces would drive north from Olenkin, while Canadians pushed south from Caen, meeting near Falaise to complete the encirclement. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers would be caught in the trap. General Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth watched Canadian tanks advancing across the Caen-Falaise plain with grim resignation. "We cannot hold them," he radioed to Corps headquarters. "Request permission to withdraw to the Seine." As night fell on August 8th, the dimensions of the catastrophe became clear to German commanders in the field, even if their superiors in Berlin remained blind to reality. The Morton counterattack had failed completely. American forces were racing northward from Olenkin, and Canadian armor was grinding steadily south toward Falaise. The trap was closing with mathematical precision, and nearly 250,000 German soldiers found themselves staring into the abyss. Von Kluge studied his situation maps in the flickering candlelight of his bunker, red pins marking surrounded units and blue arrows showing Allied advances from 3 directions. For the first time since the war began, the field marshal contemplated the unthinkable, the complete destruction of an entire German army group in the space of a few days. The thunder of artillery rolled across the Norman countryside like an approaching storm, as Major General Wade Hyslop's 15th Corps raced north toward Argenton on August 12, 1944. Captain Robert Thompson, commanding a company of the 5th Armored Division, watched German vehicles streaming eastward in panic through his tank's periscope. The southern jaw of the Falaise trap was about to snap shut. "Driver, advance," Thompson shouted over the engine noise. His Sherman tank lurched forward, followed by dozens of others in a steel avalanche that would close the escape route. For Army Group B behind them, the roads were clogged with American supply columns racing to keep pace with Patton's lightning. "Advance." This was blitzkrieg in reverse, American mobility crushing German defenders who had once seemed invincible. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Weber of the 9th SS Panzer Division crouched in a roadside ditch as American fighter bombers screamed overhead, their machine guns stitching lines of death across the retreating column. His division, which had started the Normandy campaign with over 15,000 men, now numbered fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers. The roads to the east were becoming death traps as Allied aircraft hunted German vehicles. With methodical precision, Herr Oberst, his communications sergeant, called out, "We've lost contact with Corps headquarters. The Americans have cut the telephone lines near seas." Weber nodded grimly. Communication breakdowns were becoming routine as the pocket tightened. Units were operating in isolation, making desperate decisions based on outdated information or no information at all. From the north, Canadian forces continued their grinding advance toward Falaise despite fierce German resistance. Major David Curry of the South Alberta Regiment led his Sherman tanks across the shell-torn fields near Saint-Pierre-sur-Dives, engaging German anti-tank guns that emerged from concealed positions like deadly phantoms. The fighting was vicious and personal, with neither side giving quarter in the race to control the vital crossroads. As documented in Terry Kopp's Fields of Fire, the Canadians in Normandy, the Canadian advance toward Falaise faced some of the war's most determined German resistance. The gap between American and Canadian forces was narrowing with each passing hour. At Allied headquarters, General Montgomery studied the situation maps with barely concealed excitement. "If we can close this pocket," he told his staff officers, "we'll bag the entire German army in one stroke. This could end the war in the West by Christmas." But closing the pocket was proving more difficult than anticipated. German forces, fighting with the desperation of trapped animals, were conducting a skillful fighting withdrawal that kept the escape routes partially open. SS Oberfuhrer Kurt Meyer's 12th SS Panzer Division conducted a series of savage counterattacks that temporarily halted Canadian advances near Falaise, buying precious time for thousands of German soldiers to slip through the narrowing gap. General Bradley faced a crucial decision at his headquarters near Avranches. Patton's forces had reached Argentan and were poised to drive north toward Falaise. But this would place American troops dangerously close to advancing Canadian forces. The risk of friendly fire incidents was enormous, especially with both armies converging on the same objective under combat conditions. Hold at Argentan, Bradley ordered, despite Patton's vociferous protests. The decision would later generate controversy among military historians, but Bradley's caution potentially prevented a catastrophic fratricidal clash between American and Canadian armor in the confused fighting around Falaise. Inside the shrinking pocket, German forces struggled to maintain cohesion as their world collapsed around them. Field Marshal von Kluge had been recalled to Berlin summons. That usually ended with a firing squad and was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model. Model's reputation as the first fireman had been earned through his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts, but even his legendary skills seemed inadequate for this crisis. Colonel Wilhelm Teddow of the 7th Army watched American artillery shells burst among his retreating columns with mechanical regularity. His men were exhausted, their equipment was breaking down, and ammunition was running dangerously low. Radio intercepts indicated that American forces were less than 10 kilometers south of Falaise, while Canadians were approaching from the north. The pocket was becoming a cauldron of destruction that threatened to consume everything inside it. As darkness fell on August 12th, the fate of nearly 250,000 German soldiers hung in the balance. The trap was closing, but it wasn't shut yet. In the desperate hours ahead, courage and terror would walk hand in hand along the roads to Falaise. The screaming of German soldiers mixed with the thunder of artillery as American howitzers pounded the crossroads near Chambois on August 19, 1944. Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan of the 90th Infantry Division pressed himself against the stone wall of a bombed church, watching German vehicles burn in the village square. The Falaise pocket had become a killing field where death came from all directions. "Jesus Christ," whispered Private Danny Morrison, O'Sullivan's radio operator, as another flight of P-47 Thunderbolts dove on a German convoy, struggling to reach the Dives River. The fighter-bombers' rockets turned vehicles into twisted metal and human fragments, while survivors stumbled through the smoke like ghosts emerging from hell. This wasn't war anymore, it was systematic extermination. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann's half-track had been destroyed by American artillery 2 days earlier, and now he led the remnants of his company on foot through the nightmare landscape of the pocket. Dead horses and burning vehicles lined every road, while the stench of decomposing corpses hung in the summer air like a poisonous fog. His men moved like zombies, their faces blackened by smoke and streaked with tears of exhaustion. "How much farther to the river, Herr Major?" asked Corporal Franz Weber, a 19-year-old from Bavaria who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. Hoffmann checked his compass and map, though both seemed useless in this landscape of destruction. "2 kilometers, maybe 3. Keep moving." But they both knew that reaching the Dives River didn't guarantee escape, it only meant trading one form of death for another. The roads had become rivers of human misery. Wounded German soldiers lay abandoned in ditches, their cries for help echoing across fields littered with destroyed equipment. Horse-drawn supply wagons, their drivers long dead, wandered aimlessly until allied fighter bombers spotted them from above. Captain Robert Thompson's Sherman tank rolled through the village of La Bourg-St. Leonard, his crew silent as they witnessed the scale of destruction. German prisoners stumbled past in endless columns, their hands raised above their heads in surrender. Many were barely teenagers or men old enough to be grandfathers. The Wehrmacht was scraping the bottom of its manpower barrel. "Look at those poor bastards," murmured Thompson's gunner, Sergeant Tom Bradley. Even hardened American veterans were shocked by the condition of their enemies. These weren't the confident soldiers who had conquered Europe in 1940. In 1941, these were the desperate remnants of a dying army, fighting not for victory, but for the simple chance to see another sunrise. Polish forces of the 1st Armored Division, fighting alongside Canadian troops, closed the final escape route near Chambois on August 19th. Major Alexander Stefanovich watched German vehicles attempting to ford the Dives River. Under heavy fire, their desperation palpable even from a distance. For Polish soldiers who had watched their homeland crushed in 1939, this moment carried special meaning. They were helping to destroy the army that had enslaved their nation. Inside the pocket, German commanders struggled to maintain military discipline as their units dissolved into armed mobs. General Heinrich Eberbach attempted to coordinate breakout attempts from his mobile headquarters, but communications had virtually collapsed. Units were operating independently, making their own desperate attempts to reach German lines east of the Seine. Colonel Kurt Meyer led one of the last organized breakout attempts on the night of August 20th, gathering survivors from multiple SS divisions for a final assault on Allied positions near Trun. His force included fragments of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Getz von Berlichingen, names that had once struck terror across Europe, but now represented the death throes of Nazi Germany's military might. The breakout began at midnight, with Meyer's force attacking under cover of darkness. For a brief moment, it seemed they might succeed in punching through Canadian lines. But American artillery, directed by forward observers with perfect visibility over the flat Norman terrain, turned the assault into a massacre. Meyer himself barely escaped, leading fewer than 200 survivors eastward toward the Seine. Dawn on August 21st revealed the full scale of the catastrophe. The Falaise pocket had been crushed like an eggshell, leaving behind a landscape that resembled images from Dante's Inferno. 50,000 German soldiers had been killed or wounded, while another 200,000 had been captured. An entire army group had been destroyed in less than 2 weeks of fighting. As Allied forces began the grim task of clearing the battlefield and possessing thousands of prisoners, the magnitude of their victory became apparent. The Wehrmacht in Western Europe had suffered a blow from which it would never recover, and the road to Berlin lay open before the advancing Allied armies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the killing fields near Falaise as Captain Robert Thompson climbed from his Sherman tank to survey the devastation on August 22, 1944. The silence was almost more disturbing than the battle noise had been, a deathly quiet broken only by the moans of wounded soldiers and the crackling of still-burning vehicles. The Falaise pocket had been eliminated, but the cost in human life defied comprehension. Thompson picked his way carefully through the wreckage, stepping over abandoned weapons and personal belongings scattered like leaves after a hurricane. A German photograph lay face up in the dirt, a young soldier smiling beside a woman and small child. The captain bent down and picked it up, studying faces that would never smile again. War had a way of reducing grand strategies and national ideologies to individual tragedies played out in muddy fields. Major General Guy Simons of the 2nd Canadian Corps stood on Hill 117 overlooking the Dives River Valley, watching American medics tend to wounded German prisoners. His Canadian forces had fought with exceptional courage to close the northern jaw of the trap, but victory brought its own burden of responsibility. International law required humane treatment of prisoners, even those who had served a regime dedicated to genocide and conquest. "Sir," reported Colonel Bruce Matthews, commander of the Canadian Artillery, "preliminary counts show over 40,000 German prisoners in our sector alone. We're running out of facilities to hold them all." Simons nodded grimly. The logistics of managing such massive numbers of captives was becoming almost as challenging as the battle itself had been. Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan walked among the abandoned German equipment, marveling at the sheer quantity of material left behind. Panzer IV tanks sat beside the road with their guns pointed skyward in surrender, while self-propelled artillery pieces bore the scars of direct hits from Allied fighter bombers. The German war machine, once the most efficient military force in history, had been reduced to scrap metal and spare parts. As referenced in Russell Hart's Clash of Arms, How the Allies Won in Normandy, the material losses suffered by German forces in the Falaise pocket were catastrophic, including nearly all of their heavy equipment west of the Seine River. Private Danny Morrison, still serving as O'Sullivan's radio operator, found himself face-to-face with a group of young German prisoners who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. Their uniforms hung loose on thin frames, and their eyes held the hollow look of children who had seen too much death too soon. "Christ, Sarge," Morrison whispered, "they're just kids." The human cost extended beyond German casualties. Canadian forces had suffered nearly 4,000 killed and wounded during their drive toward Falaise, while American losses approached 6,000. Polish forces fighting with the Canadians had paid an especially heavy price, with the 1st Armored Division losing over 800 men in the final assault on Chambois. Victory always extracted its tribute in blood. Colonel Wilhelm Teddow sat in an American prisoner of war compound near Bayeux, staring at his hands while trying to comprehend the magnitude of his army's defeat. 2 weeks earlier, he had commanded a full regiment of the 7th Army. Now he was one of over 100,000 German prisoners, dependent on American generosity for his next meal. The Wehrmacht's reputation for invincibility had died in the Norman hedgerows. General Omar Bradley toured the battlefield on August 23rd, accompanied by war correspondents documenting the Allied victory for newspapers back home. But Bradley found it difficult to celebrate while surrounded by so much carnage. Professional soldiers understood that killing enemy forces was sometimes necessary, but they took no pleasure in the sight of human destruction on such a massive scale. This is what happens when a modern army gets caught in the open, Bradley explained to correspondent Ernie Pyle. Technology has made warfare so destructive that entire formations can be eliminated in a matter of days. The Germans learned this lesson the hard way. Pyle nodded and continued taking notes, knowing that readers in America needed to understand both the magnitude of victory and its terrible cost. Allied intelligence officers began the massive task of interrogating German prisoners to assess the strategic impact of the Falaise battle. What they learned exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Army Group B had been virtually destroyed as an effective fighting force. Field Marshal Model's replacement army was a hollow shell, lacking the equipment, experienced personnel, and cohesion necessary for sustained resistance. The road to the German border now lay open, but Allied commanders knew that closing the Falaise pocket was only one step toward ultimate victory. German forces would undoubtedly attempt to establish new defensive lines along the Seine River, and the Wehrmacht's capacity for regeneration should never be underestimated. Still, the destruction of so much enemy strength in a single battle had fundamentally altered the strategy. See balance in Western Europe. As the sun set over the battlefield on August 23rd, Allied burial parties began the grim task of interring thousands of German dead. Military cemeteries would preserve the memory of soldiers who had fought bravely for a cause that history would judge harshly. In death, they had found the peace that had eluded them during their final, desperate days in the Falaise pocket. The darkness before dawn on August 20th, 1944, provided the only cover for the desperate German soldiers attempting to escape the tightening death trap near Chambois. SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Monk crouched behind a destroyed Panzer IV tank, studying the American positions through his field glasses, while planning what might be his division's final breakout attempt. Herr Oberfuhrer, whispered his aide-de-camp, "The men are ready, but we have ammunition for perhaps 1 hour of fighting." Monk nodded grimly. Was down to fewer than 800 effective soldiers. Their Tiger tanks had been abandoned for lack of fuel, their artillery silenced by American counter-battery fire. Major Alexander Stefanovich of the 1st Polish Armored Division watched the German breakout attempt develop through his binoculars, feeling a grim satisfaction as enemy soldiers emerged from their hiding places. Like rats fleeing a sinking ship, his Sherman tank, nicknamed Warsaw, bore the scars of battles fought from Normandy. To this moment of reckoning, for a Polish officer whose homeland had been crushed in 1939, this was justice delayed but not denied. The breakout began with a desperate charge across open ground, German infantry running through machine gun fire, while their few remaining vehicles provided covering fire. SS soldiers, fighting with the fanaticism of cornered wolves, temporarily overwhelmed Polish positions near Hill to 62. For 30 minutes, it seemed they might actually punch through Allied lines and escape eastward. But American artillery, pre-registered on all likely escape routes, turned the breakout into a massacre. Forward observers called down concentrations of high-explosive shells that shredded German formations with mechanical precision. The few vehicles that survived the barrage ran directly into American tank destroyers, positioned in concealed positions along the roads leading east. Captain Robert Thompson watched German soldiers surrender in groups of 50 and 100. As their breakout attempt collapsed, many threw down their weapons and raised their hands without firing a shot. The fight had gone out of them completely. "Take the prisoners to the rear," Thompson ordered his men, "and make sure they get medical attention. This war is almost over for these poor bastards." Not all German attempts to escape involved organized military operations. Thousands of soldiers had discarded their uniforms and were attempting to blend in with French civilian refugees streaming eastward. American military police established checkpoints along major roads, checking identification papers and searching for concealed weapons. Many German soldiers were betrayed by their inability to speak French, or by the distinctive military haircuts that marked them as recently discharged Wehrmacht personnel. Field Marshal Walter Model, observing the disaster from his new headquarters near Rouen, realized that Army Group B had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. His radio messages to remaining units received increasingly desperate responses. Ammunition was exhausted, casualties were approaching 90%, and unit cohesion had completely collapsed. The pocket had become a cauldron of destruction from which only individual survival mattered. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Weber, one of the few surviving officers of the 9th SS Panzer Division, led a group of 40 soldiers through the forest north of Chambois on the night of August 20th. They moved like ghosts through the trees, avoiding roads where Allied patrols hunted for stragglers. Weber carried a pistol, with one bullet remaining not for the enemy, but for himself if capture seemed inevitable. Death was preferable to interrogation by Polish forces who had suffered under German occupation. For 5 years, the human streams of refugees created heartbreaking scenes. Along every road leading east from the pocket, German soldiers, many wounded and all exhausted, stumbled alongside French civilians fleeing the battle zone. Horse-drawn carts loaded with personal belongings competed for road space with abandoned German vehicles, while the light fighter bombers circled overhead like mechanical vultures waiting to strike. Major David Curry of the South Alberta Regiment, fighting with Canadian forces near Trun, witnessed scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. German medical personnel were overwhelmed by casualties, operating on wounded soldiers in roadside ditches without anesthesia or proper surgical instruments. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of enemy medical facilities, but the scale of suffering exceeded all capacity to provide adequate care. As dawn broke on August 21st, the final escape attempts collapsed in complete failure. The roads leading east were clogged with burning vehicles and German dead, while thousands of prisoners stumbled westward under Allied guard. The Wehrmacht units that had conquered Poland, France, and most of Europe in a series of brilliant campaigns had been reduced to armed rabble fleeing for their lives through the Norman countryside. Allied intelligence officers would later estimate that fewer than 20,000 German soldiers successfully escaped the Falaise pocket, most of them by discarding their uniforms and equipment to travel as civilian refugees. The destruction of Army Group B was so complete that it fundamentally altered the strategic balance in Western Europe, opening the way for rapid Allied advances that would carry them to the German border within weeks. The Battle of the Falaise pocket had ended, but its implications would resonate through the remaining months of World War II and into the post-war world that would emerge from the ashes of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. General Dwight Eisenhower stood amid the carnage near Chambois on August 25, 1944, his face grim as he surveyed what would later be called one of the greatest military disasters in German history. The Supreme Allied Commander had witnessed battlefields from North Africa to Italy, but the scale of destruction in the Falaise pocket exceeded anything he had previously experienced. Nearly an entire German army group had been obliterated in less than 2 weeks of fighting. "This is the end of the German army in the West," Eisenhower remarked to General Omar Bradley, who accompanied him on the tour of the battlefield. Abandoned German equipment stretched as far as the eye could see. Panzer tanks, with their turrets blown off, self-propelled guns tilted at impossible angles, and thousands of vehicles that would never move again. The Wehrmacht's reputation for mechanical efficiency had been reduced to twisted metal and spare parts. British war correspondent Alan Moorhead walked among the German dead, documenting scenes that would shock readers across the English-speaking world. "The roads were choked with wreckage and the bodies of men and horses," he wrote. This was not war as it had been fought in previous centuries, but industrial killing on a scale that reduced individual courage to statistical insignificance. Captain Robert Thompson's Sherman tank crew worked alongside American engineers to clear the main road from Falaise to Trun, a task that required bulldozers to push aside hundreds of destroyed vehicles. Thompson found himself thinking about the German photograph he picked up 2 days earlier, the smiling soldier with his wife and child. Somewhere in Germany, that woman was probably still waiting for news that would never come. The prisoner of war statistics told the story of German catastrophe with mathematical precision. Over 50,000 German soldiers had been killed in the pocket, while another 200,000 had been captured. Entire divisions had been reduced to company-sized remnants, and most of the Wehrmacht's heavy equipment west of the Seine River had been abandoned or destroyed. The 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army existed only on paper. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, now a prisoner in an American compound near Bayeux, sat with other captured officers trying to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. The professional soldiers among them understood that Germany's position had become hopeless. With Army Group B destroyed, there were insufficient reserves to defend against Allied advances toward the German border. The war in the West was effectively over, even if fighting continued for several more months. Allied intelligence officers began the complex task of assessing the strategic implications of their victory. German resistance would undoubtedly continue along the Seine River and at the Siegfried Line, but the destruction of so much experienced personnel and equipment meant that future German defenses would be improvised affairs manned by teenagers and old men. The Wehrmacht's backbone had been broken in the Norman hedgerows. As documented in Carlo d'Este's decision in Normandy, the Battle of the Falaise Pocket marked the effective end of organized German resistance in Western Europe, opening the way for Allied forces to reach the German border within weeks rather than months. General George Patton arrived at the battlefield on August 26th, characteristically eager to exploit the victory by driving his Third Army eastward as rapidly as possible. "We've got Jerry on the run," he told his staff officers. "Now we need to keep him running until he surrenders or dies. No time for consolidation. We push east until we reach Berlin." But other Allied commanders urged caution, pointing out that rapid advances created logistical problems that could prove disastrous. If German forces managed to mount effective counterattacks, the argument between those favoring bold advances and those preferring methodical consolidation would continue throughout the remainder of the European campaign. French civilians began returning to their liberated villages, finding landscapes transformed by modern warfare. Farms had been reduced to shell holes and rubble, while livestock lay dead in fields poisoned by chemical explosives. The price of liberation extended far beyond military casualties, to encompass the destruction of an entire way of life that had existed for centuries. Field Marshal Walter Model attempted to establish new defensive positions along the Seine River, but his forces were inadequate for the task. The German soldiers who had escaped the Falaise Pocket were demoralized and exhausted, lacking the equipment and leadership necessary for sustained resistance. As September dawned over Western Europe, the strategic situation had been fundamentally altered by the destruction of Army Group B. Allied forces would continue their advance toward Germany itself, while the Wehrmacht struggled to improvise new defenses from the remnants of shattered divisions. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket had shortened World War II in Europe by months, saving countless lives on both sides by demonstrating the futility of continued German resistance. The Norman countryside would bear the scars of the battle for decades, but its strategic consequences echoed far beyond the local landscape. In the space of 2 weeks, American, British, Canadian, and Polish forces had achieved one of the most complete tactical victories in military history, destroying an entire German army group and opening the way for the final advance into the heart of the Third Reich.